just thought you'd like to know that those of you that are tweeting or twittering, we've now trended on the global top 10 with the hash HHL09, so keep buzzing away on that. It makes us quite proud as a group. Our next speaker is Malcolm McLaren. I invited Malcolm to talk at this year's conference following a series of meetings that we had over Christmas. I'd known Malcolm from an earlier part of my career, and we'd remained in contact and stayed friends. It hadn't occurred to me initially, to tell you the truth, to invite Malcolm to Handheld Learning, being an educational conference. But as we spoke one evening, putting the world to rights, we got onto the subject of transformation and what was happening in the world, not just in the financial markets, just generally in all areas. And it struck me that we might not find too many Malcolms in our current educational system, or if they were there, we wouldn't develop them and wouldn't nurture them, wouldn't find them. And that this would be a loss, because love Malcolm or not, he is someone that has not only been successful at continuous reinvention, but has stimulated numerous cultural movements within his own lifetime. I'm not going to read through an entire kind of biography because it's frankly far too long. From managing various recording bands, from the Sex Pistols, Boy George, Adamant, Bow Wow Wow, to directing films, producing Fast Food Nation with Steven Spielberg, who's been working with him. He ran for mayor, getting 10% of the vote. It just goes on and on. Just recently, he was exhibited at the Royal College of Art. So really to define Malcolm as this person or that person is very, very hard for me, and I think he's undefinable. But what he does do is re-innovate over and over again, and for that I applaud him. So I'd like to invite Malcolm McLaren to the stage for his reflections on learning. Malcolm McLaren.
Well, this is not my subject. It's not typical of what I do. I've actually never spoken about this before. So it's my first time, and it was kind of Graham to ask me to come. But it was much more difficult for me to think what the hell I was going to do here. My own humble experience, I suppose, is the best way for me to offer some use in this debate and conference. And my experience of attending or not attending, more often, schools in London, both at junior, senior, and further education levels, I have these comments to make that goes towards some way of providing useful debate here. From all the experiences I've had at school, and that I managed to put to use here in the UK, I've frankly been accused of being a charlatan, a con man, or maybe most flatteringly, a culprit responsible for turning British popular culture into nothing more than a cheap marketing gimmick. And maybe this is, right now, my chance of proving everything they've said is absolutely true. For me to sum up, and it's important to sum up, if you can, all popular culture today in a simple phrase, is really akin, I think, in many respects to the word education. All popular culture today, from Hollywood and all that means, television, the media, even politics, accepts and goes to great lengths, I think, to promote the idea that it's cool to be stupid. And for that, it's a huge problem, whatever anybody says, about education today in the Western world, and particularly, I think, in the Anglo-Saxon world. I was born in a culture of necessity just after the war. And today we live far more in a culture of desires. Desire to become famous overnight. Life's actual chosen goal. Not to learn, to be intelligent, to gain experience or skills. Not to spend time struggling on anything like that. But to simply desire instant success. And hence, what the UK have done is, in popular cultural terms, is invent something called the talent show. That's its legacy, as far as I can tell. How on earth, you might say, can a child care about acquiring even an education if the culture itself is determined in making people who have little or no education at all feel cool? Everyone in this society that's based on that can all, I think, claim to be successful. For this world we live in today is no more, in my opinion, than a karaoke world, an ersatz society, which provides us with only the opportunity to revel in our stupidity and to be successful at doing just that. If I were to sum up, I guess in 2 words, how to explain what my struggle is, what exists today in terms of the battlefield. There are 2 words that sum up that culture. It is, one is authenticity, and the other, dare I say it, is karaoke. A karaoke world is a world in which life is lived by proxy. And it's life that's liberated by hindsight. And it's unencumbered by what I call the messy process of creativity. In a karaoke world, you're free from any real responsibility beyond that moment of performance. It's something that Tony Blair made a great success of. Authenticity, on the other hand, is truthfully something that is more or less the opposite. It's about discovering, I suppose, something that is real, that can only be achieved through a struggle, that adores, romanticizes, and actually makes that messy process a romantic and noble pursuit. In a karaoke world, everyone and everything is for sale. I recall Tony Blair trying to brand the UK as cool Britannia. How stupid did we all think we were to listen to such trollops? The man was an absolute buffoon and should have been hung, at the first point on Marble Arch where Tyburn once stood. As far as I was concerned, you really have to look hard today at a situation in which, in a karaoke world, everything and everyone is for sale. In a world that struggles to find something authentic, and maybe you do, a bit like looking for a ruby in a field of tin, I'd say, and it invariably or usually is not for sale. So what do most artists, what do most creative people do? They spend their entire lives actually trying to authenticate a karaoke culture. But to do that, you have to be some kind of alchemist, a magician, to make that happen. And those people are very rare today. I was a war baby. That means someone whose parents met during the war, you were born directly after the war, and they immediately split up on gazing at you for the first time you came out of that hole. To be at school proved difficult for me. Proved difficult for probably a lot of other war babies. School and life back then was pretty disorganized. And all I can recall is spending one day at the age of 5 in school, and I never attended again till I was nearly 8 years of age. So I didn't go to school when most people went to school. I actually hid inside my grandmother's house and only looked at the world through the letterbox, often for the laundryman or the ancient Breton creature on his bike coming to sell onions at a particular time of year, or some guy walking around trying to pick up scrap iron. There were 101 different kinds of town criers in those days, offering their wares at all junctions in the village of Stoke Newington, where I lived. London was different then. You never spoke to the police. You never dared. It was considered something scary. You just spoke to villains, gangsters who stood on the street corners offering you all kinds of things that you couldn't ordinarily buy in the stores. London was a band of communities, and the education you had was the experience on that street. It taught you many things, and as the economy got going, those things began to peter out and change. Suddenly, you were confronted with TV, a program I recall as a child called Dixon of Dock Green that professed that, and I think it must have been sheer propaganda on behalf of the BBC and the government to mine, that to get people to talk to policemen if they were ever in trouble. And this guy was your good neighborly policeman called Mr. Dixon, PC Dixon, and every Saturday night at the right time, he would come on and show you and demonstrate how good and godly he was. Of course, my grandmother immediately turned off the TV and thought, this is complete garbage. You can't watch this. You can't speak to such filth. And I understood at an early age that England bred and basically taught through TV and later on through school what I can best describe as a culture of deception. England was a nation of liars, born in school. You would, at the age of 8, I recall confronting a classroom where a large political map of the world existed on the wall, and the teacher with a long cane would hit that map every so often, and on it, much of it was painted in this dreadful, horrible cyclamen pink. It was gaudy, and he looked at us all and said, "That's ours!" And you were looking at it, and it was more or less half or more of the world. Of course, when you left school, you realized it was complete nonsense. None of it was. It had all changed. He was practicing and talking about things that really didn't truthfully exist. And he didn't dare discuss all the insurgency battles that were going on as people continued to claim back and liberate themselves from such authorities and fearful repression by the English so-called empire. This you learned, of course, as you got older. In secondary school, I did like a few teachers. I recall one who constantly, he was in charge of history. And he had a joke, he said, about Marilyn Monroe and the cannibals. And every time we asked him to tell us this joke, he would have said, no, you're far too young. I recall him at the end of the first term when I was, like others, dragged into the school assembly room. And he jumped up on stage and he played a song on the piano. And it was the first time I witnessed what I suppose could be termed then a rock and roll record, a rock and roll song. It was called Goodness Gracious, Great Balls of Fire. And I watched him, and I actually thought his head was going to fall off his shoulders because it was shaking so much. And I was sitting front row, and I thought I was going to get it in my lap. And it was, I have to say, it was a cultural moment for me. And it did transport me in some strange way as I began to reach puberty, that sense of desire hit me where it truly hurt. And you went out and you grabbed all you could. Not that you got very much at the end. One prayed at the altar, but you didn't get any sex or sexual satisfaction, as Mick Jagger was later to record. I finally, after leaving school at 16, not wanting to continue anymore, I'd spent most of my days, I have to say, digging up the garden at the back of the staff room because I was consistently late, literally 300 days a year. And most of my breaks and time was spent looking at worms. I was glad to leave, I guess, but not glad to have a job. My mother, a dreadful snob, desired something for me, and upon looking at the Labour Exchange and the man who read out like a Magna Carta a whole list of possibilities and prospects, from shelling peas in a factory to making of biros or some such nonsense. And then something that caught my mother's attention was a trainee wine taster. God knows, I hadn't even drunk a glass of wine. I had no idea what was going on, but that was it for her. This was something she could at least exchange with others at some soiree or cocktail party, that her son was a trainee wine taster. So I ended up in a Dickensian garret at the top of an old building adjacent to the Royal Academy of Art in London. And there, I was confronted with these horrible military ex-generals and captains who had obviously lived their life in a hammock in some goddamn Far Eastern place in Borneo or somewhere with a crate of Beaujolais under it, drinking their life away because their faces were so red, I just couldn't believe it, and they had blue lines through it, like a cheese. And so we would, with a number of other kids into this wine tasting career, would address him in private as old Blueface. It wasn't fun, but it was interesting when I recall now, having to tell these stories to you, that London was a forlorn place, and these people were people coming back from once having ruled the empire to now still in their mid-40s and having certain life left in them to work, were now on Civvy Street teaching us, can you imagine, about wine tasting. Well, let me tell you how it went. This form of education was extraordinary because I was a virgin, as were many others in the group at the time. Well, wine would be discussed not in terms of citrus fruits, black currants, apricots or whatever, but totally in terms of sex.
This wine, it's got too much fat under the arm. This one, virginal, needs to open a bit, get that leg spread out, McLaren, and then we can drink it as God appointed us. This wine, that's all right for those frogs. Tastes like an army's been through it. This wine doesn't know what sex it is. This wine, definitely homosexual.
Well, you have to imagine this was all done with blindfolds, as you were hearing this guy beating your head with such stuff, and you, having tasted the wine, yes, sir, you would say, this wine's virginal. Yes, sir, it needs to open up a bit, air a bit, so then we can drink it, right? So just like God appointed us.
That's right, McLaren. And what's this like? Tastes like an army's been through it, sir. All mud, dirty, horrible. That's right. Just good for the frogs, but not for us English. We don't go in for that stuff.
And at the end of every lunch hour, we would be marshalled downstairs, like we were in the army, and we would walk with the colonel at the front across Piccadilly, down into some greasy spoon little cafe, and with our so-called luncheon vouchers, we would indulge in spotted dick, which was one of the feasts in such cafes at that time. If I recall, it was a sausage roll with custard over it. It was absolutely dreadful. And one day, I just couldn't take it anymore. I would always be arriving home drunk. I would never, ever get off at the stop on the underground that I was supposed to. I would end up always at the end of the line, waking up and going all the way back to my stop. It was impossible because I was not used to wine, even though we spat it out. It didn't matter, 11s and 4 o'clocks. You think were time for tea, but oh no, not here. It was time to indulge in every kind of port and sherry the company, Sandymans, were proud of. You even had to wear their cufflinks. And one day I decided to avoid this colonel and dive into an alcove, a shop of some sort, I thought, and let the group march past and wait there with my heart beating for about 4 or 5 minutes, thinking and hoping the coast was clear. I would then relax, and it was a complete chance incident. I happened to be standing in the foyer of St. Martin's School of Art on Charing Cross Road. And I thought these girls looked great as they kept filing past, and I followed them in, curious to see what was inside this school. And I came across, as I marched upstairs, looking through these little windows, at people on easels, drawing with charcoal and pencil. This huge, abundant woman with enormous breasts, utterly naked. And I thought, Oh, this is a far better job. What do I want to be doing with these kernels? This is dreadful. I've got to get myself fired. And I promptly did by smoking a whole packet of those filthy French cigarettes, as they called, gitane, and filled the tasting room with clouds of smoke. So when the colonel arrived back from lunch, he would declare in his most racist and nasty term, "What filthy Turk has been in here?" And of course I immediately claimed the guilty party. And he said, "Well, I'm going to write to your mother, you're nothing more than a saboteur." And of course I adored the very thought that I was now going to be thrown out. And shortly afterwards, I did, against my mother's wishes, attend art school. Art school became very interesting to me for the first time in my education, in that by drawing, by working on my creative side, it helped me get along with myself. It provided me with a way in to a world that I didn't truthfully quite understand. It gave me an identity that I actually didn't have, and it gave me a pursuit. Funnily enough, this may shock most of you because I'm so old and you're so young, that at that time, on my first day in art school, I recall I was surrounded by kids in short trousers. I thought, my God, I didn't realize it. We're starting in the junior. I thought I was being put into the junior department of this art school. But no, these 12-year-olds were chosen from local schools as having a certain talent, poached out of those schools, and put into an art school so they could develop that side of themselves. That may be genius. That was back in those days, and I think that followed the actual manifesto of none other than that grand old socialist designer artist, William Morris. And if it hadn't have been, as some teacher said, for old Bill Morris, none of us would be here, because he was the guy that set out to hammer down the door of Queen Victoria to make everyone throughout this country have at least a day or so, after toiling in the factory or working in the mines, to get up and make something beautiful with their lives, with in some form or another, a piece of embroidery, a pot, a painting, and so on. And during the course of that, all these so-called working class institutions were created, which later were labeled art schools, and voila, this is where I sat. My first lecture was very important to me. I didn't know at the time. A goatee-bearded professor, probably still hanging on to those romantic ideas of William Blake or William Morris, struck a chord that made it difficult for everyone new in attendance, the little 12-year-old boys in short trousers, myself and others, of what our role was, of what we came to be and why we came to be in this art school. It was clear, as he said, if you think any one of you are going to be successful painters, sculptors, graphic designers, filmmakers, fashion designers, and so on, there's the door. Because you're bloody not any one of you. And we'd only literally been in that school for a half an hour, and one's head sunk into one's shoulders, and you really didn't want to catch his attention, and you didn't know what was coming next. A few minutes elapsed, and then he said, well, you know, what it is that you're going to do is you're going to learn how to fail. What did that truthfully mean was difficult for a 17-year-old like myself and others to understand. And then he went further and he said, well, you know, failure's not so bad. It helps you get up in the morning, take the pillow off your head, roll up your sleeves. This is a messy job, being an artist. And then he walked out. A year later, many had fallen off the cliff, and there were maybe half of us left. And he reappeared, a little older, of course, but with the same aggression and the same serious tone. And so he said, so I think maybe some of you have learnt about failure. And we didn't know quite what he meant. And we thought, yeah, maybe. He said, well, don't think you can just bloody fail. I thought, oh my God, what is he saying now? And he continued to say, because you can't just bloody fail, you've got to learn how to be a magnificent, brilliant, flamboyant failure, rather than any kind of benign success. That phrase haunted me for the next 5 years. I actually didn't know what he was saying, but I learned that it was something rather deep and important in my education as an artist. And I finally came to understand it. It was about being fearless of failing, because that was the only way you would ever find anything out for yourself that counted. It was the struggle of doing that. It was a journey, he said, without end, because upon arrival, if you ever do arrive, when you do, you'll be dead. And for me, it became clear that that was the only way to achieve any kind of progress, any possibility of changing the culture, and indeed, maybe just for a moment, changing life itself. That was a very romantic philosophy, that pursuit of learning, that way of working. I continued to study in art school for many years, almost 8 in total. And towards the end, after having read a number of things, in particular Baudelaire's book, Painter of Modern Life, I realized there was a sense and a way of exploring the world that was very different from what most people teach today. It was about being inspired. It was about the art of discovery of new things. It was about experiencing the unknown without any clear map. It was about being in search of that private moment than any kind of lesson. It wasn't about walking through the streets and tracing down the major sites and ticking them off a list of sort of standard wonders. Not at all. The crowd was about your domain, as the air is that, as he said, of the bird or the sea of the fish. Your passion, your whole creed was to wed that crowd and to be a passionate observer, to take an immense pleasure in taking up home, residence, in this kind of sense of multiplicity, to immerse yourself in the bath of that crowd, in whatever is seething and moving, evanescent and infinite. And even though you were not at home, but in a strange land, navigating like that, turning left when you're supposed to turn right, you would feel at home everywhere. You would see everyone. And you'd be at the center of everything. and yet you would remain hidden from everybody. And I became enthralled by that very idea. And I think, in a sense, that set me up. Those two thoughts: how to become a magnificent failure, and how to live one's life like a flaneur in Baudelaire's day, even though today is very different in the way cities look. As an art student, I became enthralled by movies of Antonioni and Jean-Luc Godard, and particularly in Godard's profound desire to eulogize the work of Roger Vadim. I never forget, I attended a lecture at the National Film Theatre, and there, a very typical, stiff English film critic from The Guardian, of all papers, asked Mr. Godard what his favorite filmmaker was, and he said Roger Vadim, and the guy nearly fell off his chair. And he said, well, not Renoir, not Eisenstein, not Murnau. No, Roger Vadim. Why Roger Vadim? Roger Vadim was known for discovering Brigitte Bardot and making the film God Created Woman. And Godard said, because Vadim is the greatest amateur. And that, as I walked out of that theatre, did more to me than anything else to inspire my journey. Being thrown out of art school with a number of other folk, disenfranchised, malfunctioning, typical war baby. What were you going to do? How were you going to deal with this horrible real world that you've stepped away from for so long? I thoroughly got depressed, actually. But 10 years later, after that lecture, the cult of the amateur was labeled punk, something I had been inadvertently responsible for, but something I owe much to that old professor who talked about how to be a magnificent failure. By 1976, I'd opened this store, Sex, on the King's Road, and conceived and named a band, the Sex Pistols. Why? I just wanted a group of young, thuggy kids who could be assassins, who could go out and destroy what I saw to be a horrible, commodified world, a world in which there was fast becoming very little space for anyone to do anything at all individual. I made clothes that looked like they were destroyed because I didn't want clothes to look new. I wanted a group to look like they were destroying everything because I didn't want them to look new. And the word pistols, just so you know, was given to them because they were barely 18 and I thought their penises would be only this big rather than this big. I basically came up with this idea of designing the first pair of bondage trousers. Why? Because I wanted trousers to appear as if you were selling them, but also appear to the average eye as trousers impossible to wear because the legs were tied together and it would be impossible to walk in. The idea of selling something so impractical really underlined and underscored everything that art professor was trying to tell me. It was a declaration of war against repression. Both the shop and the group came to represent that look of music, and equally the sound of the Sex Pistols came to represent the fashion. I'd understood during the course of art school that there were two most important moments in life. One was the desire and ultimate practice of sex, and the other was the preparation and ultimate death. And those two moments really became very important to me in configuring something that was ultimately labeled punk. I believe that sex translated into fashion became fetish, and fetishism was the very embodiment of youth. And youth had to behave irreverently. I believe that, and it had to take drugs. I believe that because of the fundamental belief in its own immortality, which it needed to assert over and over and over again. Sex became a place that was magical. Fetishism in both ways. Yes, Graham, I'm seeing you. Sex in both ways. Well, people spent hours there, and no one wanted to leave. And in it, I think I created a feeling that was both euphoric and hysterical. You felt an enormous range of possibilities, and whatever was happening couldn't be predicted. And that was fantastic, because it was a movement towards a place unknown. I made ugliness beautiful by using kidnap ransom note lettering against all values of what was perfect and good-looking typography. I made a cover of an album look like a detergent box. Why? Because the banal was important. Anyone who lost the connection with the fundamental in art also lacks the sense for the banal. I don't mean the ability to see that something is banal, but the ability to understand the artistic value of banality. I did, as Graham Brown Martin said, yes, eventually I was press ganged, basically, by some guy who had a huge grudge against Tony Blair at the time and wanted me to drop a bomb in the middle of it all and cause a lot of fuss by declaring myself a mayoral candidate at the millennium. And it was during the course of having to create some kind of manifesto, taking into account all my life and times, I decided that instead of spending money, as the government had on this dreadful dome, which really just truly represented corporate greed and their excess, it was horrible to think that that was something the UK should be proud of. I thought of spending the same money on students. Give every kid, I thought, of 18 free flight to somewhere that they could enjoy and investigate, as Baudelaire once did his own city of Paris. Be a flaneur, basically, of some kind. I thought of bringing the countryside into the parks to reconnect to life. Plant orchards in Hyde Park. Put a pig farm in Kensington Gardens right next to where Princess Di once lived. I thought of turning out all the lights and enabling a city to look at the sky. And seeing all these terrible things happening to libraries everywhere, closing down in every part of London. And in fact, the library in Stoke Newington that I grew up and lived with for so long, I thought of installing pubs in there. The only way maybe to reinvent them so we could all have a beer whilst reading Dickens or whatever. Today's art schools probably don't trade in any of that philosophy anymore. What I've understood in 20 years since Thatcher, this idea was driven out, replaced by high fees that determine who would go to art school, if you could pay or not. Changed the very way society breeds any kind of genius. Yes, we were cast out. People like me could never have possibly entered art school. I had been far too rebellious. Thatcher felt there was no need, you see, or any use for having people studying how to become failures. No, malfunctioning people who've not been set up correctly to have a trade. No. And what is this word philosophy? Well, how can you get a job doing that? Immediately, universities would just drive it off their syllabuses, and art schools became places merely for careerists. The very word that I do recall was actually driven out of your brain. Never, ever mention you were having a career at art school. In my day, you would be just spat upon. These teachers, teaching these noble pursuits, died off. And with it, I suspect, so did the philosophy. That romantic pursuit of learning and education died off with it, in my experience to date. And what's been replaced? What's been replaced? What's happened? I think technology has unquestionably put something else in its place. But it's not used necessarily correctly. If you can use technology to rediscover the idea of the flaneur, the idea of the romantic notion of learning, for learning's sake, the idea of art for art's sake, not career, then maybe, because information is accessible now, of course, at an extremely low cost. Of course, everyone knows that. But you can't fall into the trap that you can just flit around online. Use the internet and technology to discover new ideas, maybe. Be a virtual flaneur, maybe. Debate, go further and deeper, maybe. Don't take information for granted just because it's free. One did at school, and we learned back in the 50s that the UK was a nation of liars and simply taught a culture of deception. Use technology in the right way. Don't become a slave to it. That is, don't become so reliant on it that you can't calculate or read a map. Because how do you know then to turn left rather than turn right? How do you know how to even spot a lie? Use technology as a tool, just like a pencil, for learning. It's not a replacement for applied learning, basically. It's not a replacement either for experience. That's it.
Very good. Can you take a question?
Oh, okay. If you think we're okay. Do you want to...
Thank you, Malcolm, for that. There's some very well put points in there. We might have to edit the video before we stream it.
Do you want to take
No, we won't censor. We are running over time, but I want to take one question because it would be such a shame not to have one question to Malcolm. Hopefully he'll be around over the coffee break. One question, please. Gentleman at the back with the purple shirt. We've got a microphone.
Nick Kind. So how do we get away from our karaoke culture?
And the question is, how do we get away from our karaoke culture?
I think I think if you had to ask a child, how does he deal with a culture that basically declares, well, to be stupid is cool, and everybody seems to be able to enjoy that fact. It's very, very hard for anyone to pursue learning, to struggle. When you don't have to struggle, and everybody in a karaoke culture can be successful instantly, how do you change that? Why do you think people are going to learn to struggle? I think it's a pity those old boys aren't still around, to teach the other way. It's a pity, because the other way, actually, at the end of the day, is more sexy. I think it's about sexiness. I think that the authentic is more sexy than karaoke. Karaoke is about fucking an inflatable doll. The authentic is about doing the real thing. That's the difference.
Well, thank you. Well, that's a terrific way to end the